Well, good morning if you are in Lima, Peru, where we have a lot of listeners. Good afternoon if you're with me in New York City, where my guest is from, but I'm joining him or he's joining me from Valencia, Spain. You might be listening in Berlin, Germany, home of Adagio, home of the Komische Opera. You might be listening in Cape Town, South Africa, all across the world where I have an audience for Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know by now, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all over the world. My guest today is someone I've admired for a long time. I've never met him. We've never conversed. Our paths, to my knowledge, have never crossed, except I've seen his back a lot when he conducts and I'm in the audience. And his name is James Gaffigan, originally from New York City, a conductor. He joins us from Valencia, Spain, where you are chief conductor. And I want you to say in Spanish the long name of the theater. I've tried it.
Well, the easiest way is just to say Les Arts, Comunidad de Valenciana. But you could say Les Arts. Everyone will know if Les Arts, that's the opera house in Valencia.
I know that's the thing. So, but you are also chief conductor or is it music director of the Komische Opera in Berlin?
That's correct. The general music director. Yeah.
General Music.
General Music Director. Exactly.
That's right. So, I think, James, because I've never conversed with you, I've read up about you and I've heard you perform. I want to take a particular approach that I would take with a conductor about whom I know nothing. And that is, you're a young man, but you had a long and varied education. I once heard someone's education described as being a promiscuous education. And what that means is that person, who was me, went from like a hummingbird or a bumblebee, from a flower to a plant I did not turn my phone off as you're supposed to do in theaters. That's a first. Okay. So going from plant to plant and tree to tree, drawing the best from that place, from that what that has to offer, and then moving on. But the honey that you make or the song that you sing is an accumulation of all of these experiences and exposures. And you've been in many, many places. You can name the ones you want, but New England, Boston, Cleveland, San Francisco, Luzerne, Norway, Spain now, all kinds of New York City, where you're from, where you went to LaGuardia High School, which is the School of the Performing Arts, opposite or right behind Lincoln Center. You grew up on Staten Island. In New York, we say on Staten Island. And you grew up on Staten Island, which is part of New York City, but psychologically quite removed.
Correct.
And in part because until the 1960s, there was no way to reach the island or leave the island except by boat until they built a bridge into Brooklyn, not into Manhattan.
Correct.
So even at that, Staten Island is a place apart. It's large. It is filled with a lot of people who are of Irish background, Italian background, lately from Ghana, which is interesting, and Guyana. But it's the place where Garibaldi lived when he came to live in America. I don't know if you ever went to the Garibaldi house.
I didn't. No.
That's where he lived. And he helped plot the revolution to take over Italy and unite Italy on Staten Island. And Staten Island has wonderful Italian bakeries and food stores, but it is a place apart.
That's
tough
true.
because you're my first guest from Staten Island. I've been there a few times. I live very close, but talk about Staten Island growing up, because to you Staten Islanders, if I'm correct, Manhattan, where I live, was the city.
Yes, correct. Yeah. We referred to Manhattan as the city. It was the only city. And the fact is, my parents, they met in Queens, in Astoria, Queens. And they were working around I guess it was Steinway Boulevard, or what is it called?
Steinway Street.
Astoria Boulevard. They were
Astoria
around
Boulevard and Steinway Street.
right, and they lived relatively close to one another. They met, they started dating, and my grandparents stayed in Astoria, Queens. When my parents got married, they decided to. They knew they wanted to have children, and they thought Staten Island would be a nice place because there was a park behind the house, which they were looking at, and they thought it was a kind of getaway outside of the, let's say, roughness of the city. And you know what? I mean, as much as a bad of a rap as Staten Island gets, I loved growing up there. I loved having the park behind my house. I got to play with my friends every day after school and feel safe. It wasn't the most diverse place, let's say, like you mentioned. Was a lot of Italian. There was some Polish. I mean, my mother's Sicilian background and my father's Irish and Polish. There were a lot of different nationalities, but mostly white people. I had one African-American friend named Dwayne Shannon that was hilarious. His family was unbelievable. They lived on our block, but maybe the only Black family on our block. So I wouldn't call it the most diverse place in the world, but I felt very safe. We got to play a lot of sports. I got to do music in the public school, which was wonderful. I had a band director that was playing on Broadway, actually two different band directors that were playing reeds on Broadway. Mr. Gambino in elementary school and Mr. Delman when I went to IS 75, the intermediate school. So although we were a bridge and tunnel crowd on Staten Island, the city was the thing I always dreamed about being in. And I knew a lot was going on in the city. I remember Live from Lincoln Center on TV. I remember a lot of broadcast. I actually have a memory of Leonard Bernstein conducting the Candide Overture for some event. I don't know if it was the Kennedy Center in DC or with Lincoln Center. I can't really remember, but I remember seeing him on TV. And my parents always had music on in the house. But Staten Island, let's say, wasn't a cultural mecca. But like you mentioned, the food was great. The pizzerias were great. One of my favorite pizzerias, Villa Monte, was walkable distance from my house, which I loved. Ciro's Pizza. I have great memories of my mom's cooking and the different pizzerias and restaurants in Staten Island, and the delis and the bagel shops. I mean, still when I go back, the first thing I need to do is have antipasti from blah, blah, blah restaurant or pizza from blah, blah, blah restaurant. So
James, you and I are making a date right now for when you come back.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll take the ferry and I'll join you in Staten Island.
So food was always my family's love language. That was like my mom's. Every time I'm coming home to visit, if it's now or if it's 5 years ago, it's like, what do you want for dinner when you come back? That's the first question. It's not plans or anything else. Just what do you want for dinner? So I had a great childhood. I got to do both music and sports. And then it became very clear to me that I love.
I want to ask you one question before you go on. Yeah. You mentioned that you had access to music in the New York City public schools.
Yeah.
And I did. I'm older than you are. And I did. When I was in kindergarten, it was required of all kindergarten teachers that they know how to play the piano.
Yes. My kindergarten teacher did, Mrs. Samueljan. And so did Dr. Pilkington, who was a brilliant teacher it was a requirement. And we all sang in class. And it's I have a beautiful memory of kindergarten and first grade of singing. And also graduation, singing classical music, Beatles songs. It was something that was part of our daily ritual. I don't remember the Pledge of Allegiance, no offense, but I don't remember that. I don't remember my religion school. Again, no offense to any of my Catholic friends. I grew up in a Catholic church, but I don't remember. What I remember is singing. And I remember singing in church also, actually. But the public schools, it was great. I loved music in school. And I don't think there's any other reason I would have. I chose the clarinet just because that's what you do. You choose an instrument in school. And I think if that didn't happen, I'd probably be in a failed rock band or, something like that, playing guitar. And
That's something else you and I have in common. I chose the clarinet.
really,
Yep. Yep.
I loved it. I love the idea of putting it together, and then there were reeds, all the things that I disliked by the end. I loved at the beginning. Also, when I remember changing to the bassoon because I knew I could get a scholarship. My father and my teacher said, "Well, you have a better chance of getting a scholarship to college if you play a double reed instrument." I thought, "Whoa, what's a double reed instrument?" And my band director in junior high school, Barry Delman, was a great bassoon player who played in the Staten Island Symphony and on Broadway, and you know, and he taught me really well how to make reeds and how to play in an orchestra and solo repertoire, and it came naturally. I loved it. It was easy, and I love being part of band and orchestra.
So do you play the Sanson bassoon concerto?
I played the Sanson Sonata, and that's
Sonata. Okay.
really,
Am I
really
wrong? You wrote a
difficult,
sonata,
really
not a
difficult.
concerto?
But many different concertos. Yeah, I remember the Mozart. I remember Hummel. I remember preparing the Weber, this showpiece for Weber. I don't know. It was all, but I kind of felt left out playing the bassoon. I always remember watching my colleagues that played the cello or played the like. I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I was jealous of their repertoire because I chose the instrument that had the least amount of
Yeah.
soloistic repertoire and chamber music, actually. And so I love the sound of the bassoon. I still do, and I love the way genius composers uses the bassoon. But I felt left out somehow of the chamber music world.
Yeah. My father was a musician who played trombone, and my first music teacher. And he said to me, I remember all of his lessons, even if I ultimately didn't always agree with him, but I loved him and respected his opinion because it came from knowledge. He said to me, if there's a piece of music you like very much and you don't know who composed it, it was probably by Saint-Saëns.
Interesting.
And he would point out to me that Saint-Saëns composed for so many instruments in the orchestra and gave each one a moment. And not many composers did that.
That's true. That's really true. That's a great statement. And there's a lot of forgotten composers that did that. Hindemith is one of them too. Hindemith wrote a sonata for basically everyone. And I think because of his name, Hindemith, it sounds a bit serious, and people didn't. But Hindemith was loved by the Chicago Symphony when he came to conduct, and many American orchestras. But no, yeah,
If
yeah.
anybody goes to Frankfurt, on sort of the Greenwich Village side of Frankfurt, is Hindemith's house. I don't know if you've ever been there.
No,
It's
I haven't
only
been.
open
You're
on
giving me
Sunday.
lots of good information.
Yeah, it's only open on Sunday. I mean, I was working once at the opera there, and I knew that Hindemith was from there, and I started asking people, and they say, "Oh yeah, his house, but we don't go there." And I investigated; it's only open on Sundays, and
Wow.
it's a very particular house because it's a tall, narrow building, and he lived on several floors, and he divided the spaces for composing, for living,
Wow.
cooking, for sleeping. It's a very particular house, even
Interesting. I
among
have to
the
visit.
it's
Amazing.
worth it. Um, but anyway, one last Staten Island question. If you went to LaGuardia High School, which was in Manhattan,
Yeah.
and you lived on Staten Island,
Oh, the commute
um,
was a nightmare.
getting from there, because as I said, unless I don't know if you had car transportation,
No, it was a
typically one
night.
would take the ferry.
It was so complex, and people don't believe me when I tell them the story. But every day for 4 years, my father, who was amazing and a wonderful, he's a wonderful father, but he to wake up at 4:30 in the morning and wake up your teenage son at 4:30 in the morning, feed me breakfast, drive me to the train station with a friend of mine who lived a 5-minute drive from my house to Huguenot Avenue, the train station. We would take the train for half an hour to the ferry. We would wait for 10 minutes, take the 6 o'clock ferry or 6:10 ferry, I can't remember. That would get us in at, six. We would take the 6:40 ferry. Now I'm having a flashback. We would take the 6:40 ferry. It would get us into Manhattan around 7:10. 7:15, 7:20, we would take the subway on the 1 and 9, the local, up to Lincoln Center.
65th Street, Lincoln
And that
Center,
took
yeah.
about half an hour to 45 minutes, depending on the wait. And we were there a little bit before 8 and starting school 8:15 or something like that. But it was every day, 2 hours
But
of
then
commute.
also coming back so that you would
Yeah.
have classes until what time in rehearsals? And
Yeah.
then you
It
had
would
to
have,
get back
yeah,
to
I had to,
Staten Island.
correct. And then by the time I got back, I was exhausted. Sometimes I'd meet my friends, we'd play sports or we'd hang out or play video games or music. I can't remember really, but we would, then I was exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted, but I loved it. I couldn't, because I felt it was a different world. Commuting to Upper West Side of Manhattan, it was a different world. I I couldn't believe that I was then the minority there. I had a lot of Latino friends, I had a lot of Black friends, I had a lot of Asian friends, and I was introduced to different socioeconomic backgrounds, very wealthy, very poor. I remember meeting one friend getting in the elevator and Barbara Streisand walked in because she lived in the building, and I couldn't understand that this was happening. And I remember going out to Bedford Stuyvesant and feeling it was very dangerous at the time. And but I never had any problems. I was never mugged. I never had any violence. I witnessed some violent things, but I had a great childhood, and I never would have done it differently.
So I feel like I'm talking to Goethe.
I'm
Who
doing Mahler.
published
I'm doing Mahler 8 soon. I'm studying Mahler 8, and I'm doing it for the first time. So I have Goethe on the mind. Anyway, so go
well,
on.
also because he was from Frankfurt, but because he published the first volume of his memoirs when he was 22, and you could write your life up to the age of 22.
It was
I
pretty amazing. I had
Yeah.
I had an amazing life, and I mostly give credit to my friends that I met and my teachers. I had really interesting friends, and they were all so different, and I'm so thankful for that.
So then you went out into the world, which is to say universities and conservatories and so on. You brought your bassoon. At
Yeah.
what point did the conductor's baton catch your attention? How and why?
I already got bitten, or I already was fascinated with the idea of conducting in high school. I have some really clear memories of, well, this is not so, I'll tell you, I'm not ashamed of this, but I would sometimes skip part of school, let's say, to go to Central Park with friends and hang out. Other times I would go to the library, which sounds really ridiculous, but I would go to the New York, the public library at Lincoln Center. And they had
Library of the
every,
Performing Arts, which is right across the street from your high school.
from
Yeah.
LaGuardia High School. So I would leave the high school, but then go to the library, which is very unusual. And I would listen to records. I would listen to LPs of a lot of different things, but mainly the Ring Cycle of Wagner.
Yeah, I get that.
And well, you're one of the few that get that, because
Okay.
when I tell this story, they're like, okay. But at the same time, I loved rock bands like Jane's Addiction and things like this. So I had a very strange taste for music, but the Ring Cycle was fascinating. I remember I would take out George Schulte's Ring Cycle or Jimmy Levine's Ring Cycle or whatever it may be, and listen and open the score. And I was sitting around what I remember mostly homeless people, actually. There were a lot of homeless people coming and listening to records. And I got to know some of them. And I remember it was like a refuge. I loved that place. I loved going. I would spend hours there at a time. And then I would go meet my friends, or then I would go home. Or in some cases, I would go back to school. But I loved it. And then I knew from looking at these scores, I wanted to have a bigger role, or I knew that music was more important to me than one line. I needed to understand the whole aspect. And for me, mostly that came from harmony. It came from me hearing something that said, oh God, this makes my stomach drop. Why? So it was my job to find out why. And of course, I had great theory teachers and solfege teachers, but the technicality of musical theory didn't go in line with my feeling of harmony. So luckily, I learned harmony from ear first, with jazz music, with rock music. I learned how to play guitar by ear.
So,
And so,
Maestro, I'm going to call you Maestro just once. I want you to
don't do it
please
again.
explain to our listeners and to me what is harmony and what is rhythm and what is
Okay.
melody.
Yes. So harmony is the foundation of the music. So when you hear music and it gives you a feeling, there's usually a harmony there that could define why you're getting that feeling. It could be a major chord or a minor chord, a seventh chord, a dissonant chord, a cluster chord. But these are a combination of notes that add up to something that's called harmony. And you could define it. You could define most of it. And I loved that I learned harmony by feeling and not by looking at these notes on the paper. And then I had a different relationship towards harmony. And I would actually prefer that any young person interested in music would learn by what they're hearing instead of what they're seeing. But this is another whole interview. To each his own. But for me, harmony should be felt, and you should listen and feel something. Otherwise, it's abstract. It's just things on paper. A melody is notes going this way horizontally, and a series of notes that make a melody, going up and down, staying the same, but going from left to right. I would say harmony, if you look on the paper, as Mr. Rajbaran from Juilliard Pre-College said, you have to put it in shish kebab position. So you had to make a shish kebab out of all the notes, and then you could see the harmony and the chord that it is. So, and rhythm, of course, is how often the notes are played within a particular period. So for me, looking at these huge scores, it was unlocking the secrets to why this music made me feel that way. And there are some mysteries today that I can't answer. I'm not smart enough to answer. And that's like, for example, the music of Schubert. Why on earth, when you analyze this music, it's major and minor, it's quite simple harmonies, but how on earth could you feel like you want to cry, or you're smiling through tears, let's say? That is so hard to accomplish. And he does it all the time. Bach can do it too. Mozart can do it, but very few people can do it, because that's why AI would never be able to recreate what Schubert did or what Mozart did. And I'm thinking back to those days where I would hear a deceptive cadence and go, "Ooh, that made me feel funny," and then finding out why and knowing the reason why. And I just loved it. I love playing detective with these scores. So for me, high school already, I was bitten by this idea, not of conducting. And I think many people over romanticize what conducting is. Like you said, maestro. It's one of my least favorite words in the world, because
That's only used it once.
It's so silly. It's so silly, and it's such a thing of the past. People use it in Europe a lot to be kind and to be respectful, but I find it ridiculous. But the truth is, I like to know more about the music. I don't like to be in control. And I think that's a big misconception, because in the end, conductors don't make sound. We don't make any sound. It's the musicians in front of us making the sound. So if you have no respect for the musicians, they're not going to respect you, and there'll be no magic. But I think I love what I do, because it brings people together, and I get to work with all these talented people that are making the sounds in front of me. So I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a part of shaping this music that these people like Wagner and Schubert left for us. So I knew at a very early age. I got to conduct an orchestra at LaGuardia High School, Music and Art, when the conductor said, "Jimmy, you know it." It was Dvorak 8 something. "Get up there and conduct." And I was so shocked, because my only experience was making fun of other conductors' gestures and imitating them. All I could do was imitate people. And what do people say? Imitation is the cheapest form of comedy or something. It's like, I felt very
Sincerest form of flattery.
well, or yes, well, I was very much able to impersonate other people. And now people joke with me that remember me at that time and said, now, Jimmy, someone's doing you out there and making fun of you at parties and stuff like that. So for me, I took things from everyone and I took gestures from whoever, Kurt Mazur, Seiji
I'm going to
Ozawa.
pause you there because
Yeah,
it's important,
yeah.
and we're going to go deep into that topic. But you mentioned the composer twice that I want to get back to because I'd like to. Um, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera and for years after, I had the great blessing of having an hour a month with James Levine to go sit down and talk to him about whatever musical topic I was focusing on or caring about or not understanding. And for a period, I was working on a book that came out called Classical Music 101. It's a textbook. And I worked on it for years. And I wrote Opera 101 before, and that one I felt I could write myself. For the classical music book, I felt I had to talk to practitioners because I work more in opera.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go and speak to Gergiev about conducting, Krista Ludwig about Mahler, and James Levine officially was about Mozart's 40th Symphony. But after the end of writing the book, he said, "Come by, bring your manuscript, and we're just going to go through it and talk about things you still feel you need to address," which was very generous. And at the end, he said to me, "Okay, Freddie," as he called me, he said, "What composer did you not understand, get, feel much at all when you began working on this project that now is indispensable and you can't live without?" And I said very quickly, I said, "That's Schubert." I said, "I didn't get Schubert before." Now, we could be beguiled by Schubert. We could recognize the beauty, but there was something about the way Schubert's songs, but not only worked their ways into me, that I already had, let's say, with Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, and a lot of the people from that era, and many composers who came after. Schubert was the missing link.
Mm.
So Levine said to me, not "That's good, that's nice." He said, "That's right." And and so if you, James, would tell me more, whatever you want, about Schubert and
Yeah,
why he's just a single person in music.
yeah, yeah. Very. It's for me. It's simple to explain in some ways that Mozart, when you hear the Act Two finale of The Marriage of Figaro, you know you're in the presence of a genius. It's very clear. He is a man of the theater. It's extraordinary. It's witty. It's genius. It's everything. You know. I think when young people come into the world of Schubert, it's well, that's nice, and it stops there. Then something happens. Usually, life happens. You're disappointed. You're in love. You're heartbroken. You're confused. You're a teenager, and these miniature worlds of Schubert make a hell of a lot more sense to you. And then as you get older, it makes even more sense to you. And I only speak for myself in my life, but Schubert contains so much mystery to me that is beyond any analysis, and that's the beguiling thing about Schubert, and the confusing thing about Schubert is because there's not much material to talk about in a sense of an analytic an analysis, but the amount of genius little pieces he's written. I mean, Winterreise alone, and the Schöne Müller, and the symphonies which he never heard in his lifetime, maybe one or two of them. The masses that he never heard, they're just gorgeous, and it's an extension into the world of Bruckner from the world of, I don't know, Haydn and Mozart, but it's this very important figure that only lived to what, 32 was he?
31.
31 years old, like many of our rock stars died at 28 or 31. All of these, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, all these people.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, and it's even more heartbreaking to think what he would have written afterwards. But Schubert, for me, it gets even more mysterious when you read about his personality or lack thereof,
Mhm.
because he wasn't the charismatic one. He wasn't the life of the party. He was the talented guy on the sidelines, you know, playing piano and kind of entertaining people. And but it's so confusing that these pieces were written for just kind of amateur hour or friends at a party or
They
his
would have these gatherings called
yeah
Schubertiades,
yeah
where they would
and he
play
would
his
write for this
music.
orchestra, a school orchestra, and these moments of genius, the Fifth Symphony. I mean, the ending of the second movement. It's it's so shocking to me, still to this day. So I think there's a lot of mystery, and I think as a human being we relate to that and the things we can't explain. We're all really turned on by things we can't explain, and we feel
Are you
something
saying can or cannot explain?
we cannot explain.
Okay, I respectfully disagree with you. I think unfortunately we're not turned. Most people are not turned on by what they can't explain. They feel vulnerable. They feel weak. They feel out
No,
of
oh no,
control.
but that's what but I say turned on could be seen as being weak, being vulnerable. But this is like
Okay.
this is what we do. Why do we watch these really sad films? Why do we read these horrific, sad books? Um, it's to feel vulnerable and to feel something you wouldn't normally feel. And I think in the world of Schubert, it makes us so uncomfortable because yeah, we don't know why. And I always joke around with my partner, my fiance, with Marta. We watch movies. I say, "Why did you make me watch that movie?" It's just so sad. But of course, I was happy to see that because then you experience something through it. But with Schubert, yeah,
Catharsis.
right, yeah, and it's very weird, but
Yeah.
it's a very human thing. I don't think we like to admit it, but it's something. Even if you haven't experienced heartache or something, but to listen to some of these um, song cycles, it's just so sad. It's sometimes a 2.5 minute long song. You think, whoa, how did he do that?
Well,
Especially
I
with
agree with you,
limited
but
experience.
I would also maybe because though I am a New Yorker and like you, and we grew up with all kinds of diversity, which is wonderful, and we've become richer for all of the fact that we're all, we're all human, but we all have different backgrounds and ways of seeing the world, and that's a strength. But for the past 5 years, for various reasons, I've only been in New York City. I've not been back in Europe where I used to spend half my time. I'm not sure that Americans are looking for catharsis.
Huh, I see what you're saying.
And I think it's a European phenomenon, and you're more immersed in Europe right now than I
Mm.
am. But I think that Americans look for easy ways to explain complicated things, and that mystery, something I love in human beings, not in Agatha Christie, but I love I often quote a line from Verdi, Marinani, ogni cor serba un mistero. Every heart harbors a mystery. And the fact that you could be next to someone that you feel you know and love and care about and understand, we don't understand everything, and we never can.
That's for sure.
And if we feel that we have to, then it's fruitless. But if we respect that there's a mystery there and can enjoy it and see that as a wellspring of creativity and temperament and individuality, if we can accept that, then the persons we're near are more enriching for us than we are for them. But or I'm not saying all Americans, but certainly a lot of people in my country right now want explanation, want
And
something concrete to hold on to. And I'm
right.
not getting political here, although one could, but the fact that when things seem either rudderless or sands are shifting so quickly, we look for a certain amount of security and
Yeah,
stability,
yeah, yeah.
even if you can't explain that and you can't achieve it. And I
I
believe
mean,
the pursuit of that kind of black and white clarity is pointless
yeah,
when there's so much subtlety in the grays and all the other colors in between.
I agree. That's beautifully said. And We just lost someone big in the world, David Lynch. I don't know if you're a fan of the
Yes,
director.
full direct.
David Lynch always said, he said, why does everything need to have to be explained? Like what, life is so weird. So many weird things happen. So why should art make sense? And I loved about his TV shows and the movies how quirky certain things would happen. You think, why on earth? And sometimes there's no reason. Sometimes he has a reason, sometimes he doesn't. But it gets you thinking. It gets you to feel something, and sometimes you just have to laugh, or sometimes you have to just cry. And I love that about David Lynch. I love that about Schubert. It just
I agree. I
yeah.
think that's the point. That's why I made this detour into Schubert. Now I want to get back to you. Um, I've known many conductors. I have worked with many conductors. I find them as a general category very intelligent, and they're a pleasure to be around because they have ideas. They seem to think about things, even if some of them, not all of them, but some of them take on the conductor as God um, mantle. I can say that there's one conductor that I knew and studied with who did not take on that mantle, but people put it on him was Claudio Abbado,
Mhm.
was godlike because he was so extraordinary, but he never put that on. When he sat down with musicians, with artists, with singers at a table at a meal, he was just one of us at the meal, except that when he spoke, everybody shut up because we wanted to hear what he had to say. But he was not the one to lead the conversation and be the charismatic one. And he was charismatic. But um, other conductors, more of his generation and before, um, who some of whom I worked with, um, had that, tried to achieve that aura of invincibility, of genius, of maestro, of whatever. Um, and they were accorded respect because of their position and often because of their great qualities as musicians. But um, it's different now, I
Yeah,
think.
it's very different now.
Yeah.
I think, thank God.
But
It's
my question is, as you, as a younger conductor, um, knew and were exposed to a lot of these older conductors,
yeah.
and what I would like to learn very specifically about you, but in general, is the art of teaching conducting.
Mhm.
And what does it start with the score? Does it start with the hands? Mendelssohn came from a rich family. His family could afford to rent an orchestra for him to study on.
Yeah.
Most conductors don't have that.
Yes, right. The biggest challenge of a young conductor's life is having an instrument, and that's the orchestra, like you just said. So, and going very quickly back to your colleague Claudio Abbado, which you were talking about, the reason for his success is his collaborative spirit. He was all about molding the sound that the musicians were giving him. He breathed so well with the orchestra. If they needed a little space, he would allow them space. Otherwise, he would move forward in the most elegant, most organic way. He was not watch me here. And I think the biggest mistake of these old school conductors, or the ones that are disappearing, let's say, the dictators, watch me, follow me. It's me. It's not that. You need to be secure in what your interpretation is, what your musical intention is, but you have to bring an orchestra with you, physically, with words, with your facial expressions. And this is a give and take. It's not a one directional street. And when it is, it's bad music making, in my opinion. And I'm sorry to say that. And I think, thank God, this is dying. This world of like, it's my way or the highway. Follow me here. If you follow, you're late. It's, you know this from singing. You know when a conductor is supporting the singer and bringing the orchestra with, instead of when the singer's following the conductor, which is just the most ridiculous idea. So for a young conductor, I think the most important thing is inner rhythm, that you have great inner rhythm and you have an understanding of the score. That if you don't have good rhythm, you probably shouldn't be a conductor. And if you don't have good understanding of the score, you shouldn't be standing in front of the orchestra. You need to be the person who knows the most about the piece of music in the room, and or at least try to be, because you might not be when you're 23 years old standing in front of the Chicago Symphony. You're going to know it the best you can, but you better know it. Um, Once you study the score and you have an idea of how it should go, how the transition should go, how to balance chords, to balance an orchestra, physically, it's the most important thing that you stay out of the way of a great orchestra. And you only get in the way when something needs to happen differently. And this is, I think, what a lot of young conductors don't realize. They want to get up there and start lecturing right away. They want to start, now, listen to, I read this and that, and I saw so and so do that. And I think the metronome marking is like, this is so boring. Nobody wants to hear about this. You should let an orchestra play and see what difference you could make in front of them. Can you get them to move? Can you get them to breathe? Can you get them to phrase something differently with your eyes and your hands? And if not, you stop and say something. But I think a lot of conductors make the mistake of talking too much in rehearsal. And I think the physicality of a conductor is so important. How he holds, or she or they hold the sound, and guide the sound. Because what we do is anticipatory in the end. It can't happen at the same time because there's no reaction. So the breath is the DNA, the upbeat is the DNA of the sound. And that's something I really take very seriously with young conductors. If they don't show their intention on the upbeat, how are 80 people supposed to play together?
So I'm going to jump in with a couple of things
Yeah.
triggered by what you said. You use the word 2 or 3 times, breath or breathing.
Yeah.
And breathing comes obviously for wind and brass instruments because you got to breathe. For string instruments, in terms of a certain kind of group inhalation, that they're living the music in the same moment. In opera, obviously singers have to breathe and conductors have to know when they have to breathe. We were talking about Claudio Bono. One of the things he taught me, and not just me, when I was a stage director and on stage in a rehearsal, was not only where the singer had to breathe and where the orchestra had to breathe, but where Verdi or Puccini or whomever wanted you to breathe.
Right.
So that he, Bono, would be the authority on what Verdi intended at a particular moment and would allow for the breath. And if I, the stage director, if the singers, if members of the orchestra or the chorus did not know, Bono would always say, "Qui si respira," this is where you breathe.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting because the way he guided all of us performers and artists toward a common musical expression and theatrical expression was by telling us where the breathing happens.
Yeah.
And no other conductor I ever worked with in opera, because I've not worked with many in symphonic, ever took that as the approach. So I'm very
Yeah.
happy to hear what you just said.
No, that's beautiful. I never knew that about him. But I think it's so important because it's what we are, right? It's what we need to do. And I think every string player, you cannot, if you just start by moving the bow, it's, first of all, it's not going to be together. It's not going to be musical. If you don't breathe with your bow arm, it's useless. And especially if it's a syncopation or something, you need to breathe into that. And yeah, no, I think it's,
Define syncopation.
syncopation is an offbeat from a main beat. So if you have a march, dun dun da da dun da 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 da, cha 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 cha, the offbeat of it. So syncopations are when there's a gesture where nothing happens and you play off of that gesture. That's a syncopation. But these things, I always find the quickest solution to get an orchestra to play together is to breathe. And it sounds so obvious, but it's like you say, it's rarely talked about. And I think that's funny.
Now, another serious question that sounds like I'm making a joke, but I'm not. You said before about when a conductor conducts opera and the singers are looking at him and so on, or her. I teach Italian opera at NYU, and I have artists come in, and you are welcome to come join me whenever you want. And one night I had Violetta Urbano, who is a wonderful singer, great talent, firm opinions, but collaborative. But she has her firm opinions. And the Met was doing for the first time Attila. And she was singing the very punishing soprano lead, and she is a singer who sings mezzo and soprano.
Yes.
And Riccardo Muti was making his Met debut. And I said to her, as part of the conversation, when you look at Maestro Muti, she said, no, he looks at me.
This is great, but this is so good. I love that.
And I want to ask you, I mean, not to characterize them necessarily, but who looks at whom and how does that work in an opera?
In
If
it,
you're standing in the pit
yeah,
or sitting in the pit and a singer's on the stage, he, she, whatever, and how do the eyes, the breathing, the hands, how does that work
yeah.
for
This is it.
communication?
I was just talking about this. I was just talking about this to a singer and to friends. So, okay, this is, I'm going to offend a lot of my colleagues and if they watch this, but I'm going to tell the truth right
No.
now. So, the singer is in charge. The singer, especially in bel canto repertoire, Verdi, things like Traviata, Attila, Rigoletto, all these things. In Bohème, in a big aria, in Fanciulla del West, you can have rehearsals with the singer. This is the time to talk about phrasing, breathing, discussions about flexibility. When they're in front of the orchestra on the stage of the Met or at the stage in Munich or in Vienna Staatsoper, um, you as a conductor need to make their lives easier. You need to be watching them, be with them for their habits. If they tend to go slower, if they're going to take a breath, they need more time. It's our job to be there. And what's happening today is there are a lot of young singers that have been told to watch the maestro. And this drives me crazy.
Yeah.
These conductors are polluting the minds of young singers to, and they're looking at us like cats, like, what do I do? Where do I want to be with you? And I'm saying, stop being with me, just sing. And, they have enough to think about up there. They have to act. They're wearing a costume that's uncomfortable. They need to be in love with someone they don't like. They are projecting. They're doing so many gymnastics. The last thing should be watch the conductor there. It's like, it's my job to be watching and breathing with this person. And when you do things like Tristan and Isolde, when Isolde's singing, it's our job to bring the orchestra with, if it's a great artist. Most people singing Isolde, they're capable of phrasing well and making good music. So, it's our job as a conductor to bring the orchestra with the stage. With Strauss, it's a little different. With Strauss, in something like Salome or Electra, or the orchestra is this in charge. They're the priority of the soundscape, and the singers come with. This is my theory. Wagner's in the middle. There are moments where you want to make them as comfortable as possible, and you're riding this wave. You're riding the orchestra, and you're getting them to be with them, and you're helping them. With Strauss, there's not always the room for that. There are moments in Ariadne auf Naxos that you can do things like that, but in Salome, the orchestra is going. It has this life of its own, and you join or you miss the train. And it's the conductor's job to get them active. But I truly think the conductor should be watching the singer like a hawk, not the opposite. I think we've gotten into the wrong, somehow the world has become backwards. So follow the conductor. By definition, that means you're going to be late.
You won, in I believe 2004, the George Schulte conducting competition. Did you ever meet George Schulte?
I never met George Schulte. I met his wife, who had passed away, Lady Valerie,
Yep.
and Valerie was very kind to me and very good to me. I never met George Schulte. No.
I was fortunate to meet him and observe him. I didn't work with him, but I was allowed to watch.
Oh.
And specifically, he was conducting Otello with the Chicago Symphony with Luciano Pavarotti, Kira Takano.
His only time he sang it, right?
I know. And I was brought to Chicago to help, basically, and not help Schulte, but just help. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
And then it was coming to New York to Carnegie Hall, and Pavarotti was nervous about it, and he generally did have a cold. And people who were there that night at Carnegie Hall remember that they sort of set him up with a platform, and he sat there, and he had tea and broth and all kinds of things, and nobody was near him, and I made the broth actually, and and Kiri Takanawa, gorgeous, charismatic woman, was sort of to one side, and Leonucci, excellent, very lovely man, baritone the other side, and then the Casio and the other Ludovico and the other, and the Amelias were sort of away, and Luciano sat there like on a throne. And people remember the spectacle of that. He actually sang very well, but I
Yeah.
think he needed the emotional help and the knowledge that the tea and the broth were there to get him
Mhm.
through. And
I have to say, just I love that recording that they did in
it's
Chicago.
great.
It's incredible. Him singing Già nella notte dance when
And so
you
with
see that
her, yeah,
at the end of the, oh my God, it's beautiful.
yeah, it is because
It's
he
hard to
sang
think,
it
hard to imagine that he wasn't doing that role because when you don't know the backstory of him doing it for the first time, you don't hear that in the recording.
with the Chicago Symphony. Now,
Yeah.
what I want to bring out is in when I was a kid, the three big conductors, like it or not, were Herbert von Karajan, Leonard Bernstein, and George Solti.
Hmm.
And Bernstein recorded for CBS, and von Karajan for Deutsche Grammophon, and Solti for
Decca.
London Decca. Yeah. And basically, all of them got to do whatever they wanted to record. So there were complete Beethoven sets and Mahler sets, starting with Bernstein with the Mahler, and whatever they wanted. And Schulte didn't do much Bruckner, as I recall. Karajan did more Bruckner. Bernstein did some Bruckner. But whatever they wanted to do, Bernstein did Copland and certain American masters. And Schulte could have been perceived as a dictator. I wouldn't describe him that way.
Hmm.
But he was a man of very firm opinions, and he was a man who worked quickly.
Hmm.
Karajan was meditative. Bernstein was emotional, and he felt that the emotions led to the concepts and the shaping of things came from the emotion. If Karajan felt that, he didn't express it. Schulte was expeditious. He came in knowing what he wanted from the drums, from everybody,
Right.
and he would shape it. And the sound of the brass with him was very particular. And what I'm getting to with Schulte is I once a long time wrote an article called The Left Hand of God. And it was about how I watch conductors who do certain things with the right hand, with the baton typically, not always, and other things with the left hand. And to me, by far the most expressive, interesting, fascinating left hand of any conductor was George Schulte. Valery Gergiev has some of that, but not quite to the degree that Schulte did that. And I always loved being allowed to sit on stage right, his left, to watch his hand and hear what he was producing and
Hmm.
watch what the hand was doing. So you can take your answer, which is not really a question, anywhere you want. But in terms of the Schulte effect on music, in terms of, well, one thing I'll add about Schulte, people don't know. When he began, he was Hungarian. When he got out of World War II, he went, I believe, to Germany and Switzerland. He worked as a répétiteur. In other words, he played the piano and
Yes.
worked with singers and played the orchestral parts on the piano in
Yes.
rehearsals. And in that time, many, many conductors, including Karajan and others, would sit down with singers or with instrumental soloists and work with them directly. And they would find whatever they found in rehearsal.
Right.
Um, and then it would be executed in performance, we hoped. But the conductor would know what the singer wanted or needed, and the singer came to understand the conductor's point of view. Schulte's recordings to me sound completely different from the Bernstein and the Karajan, just to name two. I
Mm.
recognize them all the time because there's an energy there.
Yeah.
And there are recordings of his that I adore, even if I don't adore the singers. I'm not going to name them because that's not the point. But where I will listen to them just to hear the orchestral parts of
Yeah.
conducting and wish they had a better singer for that recording.
Right. I know. I feel the same way a lot about a lot of Schulte recordings. I think the energy, without a doubt, is always there. He was a man of energy, punch. There was a lot of punchiness to his, in a good way. And some very delicate things like the Hansel and Gretel recording with Vienna Philharmonic and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's gorgeous playing from the orchestra at times. However, I think Karajan is Karajan now. A lot of people could say, "Oh, talk about the maestro myth or the maestro thing." He always had perfect hair. He always looked good. He was very concerned with his image, and this was the world of which people like my dad and his generation saw the conductor like this, perfectly manicured person, which was kind of a joke. And I remember being a young conductor and thinking Karajan was a joke. As I got older, I realized Karajan had such a deep respect for sound and for color, and he believed in upholstered sound, really gorgeous sound at all times. And although at the end he didn't rehearse much, he trusted the Berlin Philharmonic to do this naturally. And his trust in the orchestra was extraordinary, with the Vienna Philharmonic too. And I'm amazed at some of his recordings of things like things from the Ring Cycle, or even Fliegende Holländer, or it's just, and Strauss tone poems. Bruckner,
Yes.
Bruckner also, and
I'll
Strauss.
give him that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's not always to my taste and liking. And then, like you said, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Bernstein, very emotional, and got to the point of what he thought high art was through this emotional outpouring. But then you see certain things with Leonard Bernstein is the biggest mystery, honestly, to me, more than Schulte, more than Karajan, because when you talk to the old retired Vienna Philharmonic members, they don't talk about Carlos Kleiber as being the best experience, or Böhm, or Karajan. They talk about Leonard Bernstein's Schumann, not Leonard Bernstein's Mahler, not Leonard Bernstein's Charles Ives. It's about his Schumann. It's like, how on earth is that possible? He had such deep respect from these musicians by the time he was in his late 50s, 60s. They just adored this man. And he did something so well, and some people never know about it. For example, the Rite of Spring. There was this rumor going around, I remember when I was a Tanglewood Fellow, that Leonard Bernstein rebarred the Rite of Spring to be easier in 4/4 at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And he did do certain things for technical reasons, but not because they were difficult. I think just realistic reasons of getting it together in short rehearsal time, maybe. But when you watch him conduct, I think it's the London Symphony or something. It's a black and white film of him doing the Rite of Spring live in performance. He's very young, fairly young. It's extraordinary. It's not the Leonard Bernstein we know of milking everything and taking time. It's like, it's from memory. It's so musical. It's incredible, and people don't get to see that side of him. I think there's many sides of Leonard Bernstein that we don't see anymore. We just think of the very emotional, let's say, some people say selfish music making, but I think this guy was so brilliant. My God, it's incredible.
Well, since you mentioned Schumann, I try to keep my Facebook life musical and cultural and positive for the most part. And recently, I took my mother, who's quite elderly. It is an effort to do it. We want to do it to the New York Philharmonic, where they're very welcoming of the needs to get her seated and so on. We sat in the front row, and it was the Mendelssohn first piano concerto, Beatrice Rana playing, and Marek Janowski making his Philharmonic debut at a rather advanced age. And the second part of the program was the Schumann Third Symphony. And my mother, who worked at Lincoln Center 60 plus years ago, so that I was a little boy and brought around there and got to hear the Philharmonic as a little kid, really responded to that music and to the conductor and the way we were by his left hand as it happened. And she was very engaged. And the orchestra could feel that. She didn't make any sound, but there was just something particular happening that moment. I felt it too, but I was watching her. And when the maestro finished his Schumann Third Symphony. He stepped off the podium, took the applause, and then he spotted her and he looked at her and she reached her hands up and he came to the edge of the stage, put his hand on his heart and bowed to my mother, having no idea who she was. And so suddenly on Facebook and social media, there was a conversation about the conductor bowing to an elderly lady in the audience after the Schumann Third. And when we went home, I started talking to Mom about the Schumann Third Symphony, very specifically that it was, as you said, very dear to Leonard Bernstein and very dear to Claudio Abbado.
Hmm.
They both, Bernstein had it on his table, the Third Symphony, as he lay dying. We
Wow.
know for a fact that it was the last score that Claudio Abbado looked at before he died.
Wow.
Um, and I believe that Abbado was buried with the Schumann Third Symphony score.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's very particular because here we spoke about Schubert before. When Levine said to me, which one did you most grow with? It, without a doubt, was Schubert, but Schumann and all of the guys and women, I came to respect and feel more.
Hmm.
Schumann is inextricably linked with his life story of married to Clara. He was her teacher. Brahms was in the household. All the story that's told not well, but enjoyably in a film with Katharine Hepburn as Clara Schumann. But the thing is, so what is it about Schumann
It's a
that
musician. Schumann is a musician's composer.
okay? What
I
does that
think,
mean?
I don't know, but I know that all musicians, especially string players, they're like, it's incredible. And I think they all recognize it from the symphonies and especially the chamber music. I think it's so rewarding to work on his music. Brahms is also wonderful, but I think there are more Schumann fans among professional musicians in this world, and I can't say why. I just know
I agree.
they truly love it, and I love it. It's very hard. The first symphony, the fourth symphony, both versions, they're quirky. It's like we were talking about David Lynch. There are strange things, and you wonder why. Maybe because he was losing his mind, or maybe that's too over romanticized. I don't know. But there are quirky things about these pieces that you fall in love with after a while.
I don't know where you stand, but I take the view that if we've received from history the idea that a creative artist, Vincent van Gogh, Gaetano Donizetti, Robert Schumann, had mental illness later in life, that it's supposed to be reflected in their work, or Beethoven's deafness. Beethoven wrote the Diabelli Variations very late in his life, and they're humorous.
Yes,
And so Mozart's Requiem at the very end. I don't like that facile use of thumbnail biography to explain art
I know. I
when
know.
we can't necessarily explain it. I want to get back to the left hand of God. Talk about conducting in the left hand. What is that about? And is it about anything?
Yeah, your left hand can do wonders, or it could get in the way. And I think it's a good way of when I talk to my young colleagues when they're conducting for the first time. The worst thing you could do is mirror all the time. If you mirror your right hand all the time, what's the use? Then it becomes pointless. And there's a lot of visual noise, I always say. Um, I've always loved opera because I get to use my left hand more and in a different way for singers. Sometimes it's simple cues, sometimes rhythmic gestures of before they sing. Sometimes it's showing that something is legato. Sometimes it's not doing anything and it's a stop sign. It could be anything. And I think that the great conductors use it really well. And for me, it's the most interesting tool I have
Mm-hmm.
because beating time with the right hand is quite a boring thing. It's like traffic cop. So the left hand shows expression. It could show power. It could show vulnerability. It could show anything. And I think that's so fun. It's ballet in some ways. And it can't. The weird thing is it can't be rehearsed. It has to happen in the moment. when you're dealt with the sound in that moment. Certain things you could know to tell a singer, wait, go. This is a very technical thing, but mostly the left hand is magical. It's you can do really interesting things. You can hide information. You could give information. You could tease someone with information, and that's what Valery Gergiev, you mentioned him. He gets a strange reputation for people that don't understand what he's doing. But the fact is, if Valery Gergiev wants to be clear, he can be clear. If he wants you to be on the edge of your seat, not knowing what's going to happen next, he's the best person to do that. Mm-hmm. And it gets them to play that way. And yeah, I mean, I've seen extraordinary performances with him, and I've seen some of the craziest performances with him.
I have too.
Not so good.
I've seen performances of his where I don't want to use the metaphor of a car crash.
Oh yeah,
but it's kind of like everything is zooming at such velocity and energy, and not every musician can keep up.
But when it goes well, it's extraordinary.
It's amazing. The best Firebird I've ever heard was his by far.
Yeah, I have
the New York Philharmonic.
I have some Prokofiev symphony memories where I was with my jaw open.
Yeah.
And then I have, I mean, but then I've seen some pretty crazy things too. So,
yep.
Yeah.
If the left hand is ballet, is the right hand tap dancing, or what is it?
That's good. I think the right hand is often kind of the rhythmic guide. It's often the style, the pace, the tempo. Tap dancing, I wouldn't say. I would say
Irish line dancing.
Yeah. Maybe that's a better. I don't really have a name for it. I think it's the organizational one. If you've got the artsy one and the emotion and the kind of organizational one, that's the way I would treat it. Okay. You want the stability of the right hand to help people with tempi, with transitions, and the left hand does all the things we can't put into words.
Now, you, in addition to winning the Schulte Prize, you studied with, under, around many great conductors.
Yeah,
you were in Cleveland, you were in all kinds of places.
Yeah.
And it's a 3-part question, if I remember the parts, because I'm just forming the question as I'm talking to you. But the first part is, if a conductor, let's say she, because we've been saying he, but let's say she has put her particular imprint on the orchestra in which she's the music director, if any other guest conductor comes, you or anyone, is the orchestra accustomed to the way they work with their principal conductor? Or how do they adapt, especially if you only have 3 days of rehearsal for a program, when they're used to working with her for years? What room does it give you as the guest conductor, and to what degree do they, you said you like to let them do what they want to do and guide them and so on. To what degree is it you? To what degree is it them?
Well, the first question I always ask when I'm coming as a guest conductor, and if there's a music director and she likes to do Bruckner, I'll stay away from Bruckner as a respect, and just why they get enough Bruckner with her. So the first thing I ask an artistic administration person is, I'm coming for a week. What can I do different? What do you need in the season? And then I have my favorite things that I like to do, but I'm very open to conversations. So you have to choose your battles when you're with the orchestra. What could you accomplish, like you said, in 3 days? I find when you're a different conductor than the music director, it's refreshing. I think every orchestra member would agree with that. If you're an opposite of the music director, no offense to the music director and the way she works, but if you come into town for 3 days and you're different, I think they enjoy that. It's like having a meal. You can't just have steak and potatoes every day.
You get paella.
So for me, when I come in as a guest, I'm not the type that just wants to make everyone happy and leave. I want to do something. I want something to happen, and I work hard whether I'm music director or not of the institution. That's me personally. I have some friends and colleagues that say, no, I just run and I keep running and then I leave and I want to come back. I want them to be happy, But once I stopped caring what people think all the time, I just became myself and was willing to work. I've been always invited back to places, and I'm lucky because I return to places like Chicago Symphony or San Francisco on a regular basis and LA, and I love these places for all different reasons. But I think you need to work with the strengths of the orchestra. You can't solve the world's problems in 3 days. You can solve some problems, and the musicians are thankful for that. I think a lot of conductors stay away from intonation because it's a very personal thing. I don't mind talking about it because it's
Fine intonation.
well, when something is in tune, when they're reverberating, when two pitches are reverberating the right way together, it's in tune. If not, it sounds dissonant or the vibrations are not in place. The great musicians like to work on this, even if it's a personal thing. I think they appreciate it because, especially if their music director doesn't talk about it. Of course, you can't, like I said before, you can't solve the world's problems in 3 days. So choosing your battles, having a big picture goal and a small picture goal is important. And then letting them free. You've done the work, and then stop nitpicking, stop any of that, let it go, let it make music. So I think you have to know your role, basically, is what the short answer to that is. And if there's a music director that she specializes in something, I think out of respect, stay away from that part of the repertoire.
The second part of the question, you conduct in many countries.
Yeah.
And something I'm asked all the time in the opera world, and I wonder what it's like in the symphonic world, is when I was starting out, we all had to speak Italian because that was the common language of opera.
Yeah.
And if I was working in Amsterdam or Chicago or wherever, if everyone only spoke English, okay. But if we had say a South African singer and a Korean singer and a Russian singer, we all would speak in Italian. And nowadays, I always wonder what languages or language you work in when you land, say, in the Czech Republic or Croatia or Peru or wherever. How does that work?
I think English is still the universal language to my benefit and my laziness. Language has never been a strong suit with me. I've been trying to learn German for a long time. I have kindergarten level. I could communicate with my orchestra in the most basic way. And when I need to say
kindergarten is a German word, so it's
yes,
a good
it's a good start. And my French is the worst imaginable. But I would say in the big opera houses, English is still kind of the language.
Yeah.
If you're doing it, and it depends on the repertoire. If you're doing a Russian opera like Lady Macbeth of Shostakovich, you're probably going to have a big Russian cast, and a lot of Russian is to be spoken in that room. But if you're doing, I don't know, I'm trying to give an example. If you're doing a bohème somewhere, there'll be a lot of Italian and a lot of English probably in the rehearsals room.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it varies from production to production. At Komische Opera, we're funny. When we were doing the new production of The Marriage of Figaro with Serebrennikov directing, we had so much Russian, German, and English going on at the same time. It was extraordinary. And I love it. I love that type of thing. But I'm lucky that everyone is speaking English because but in the Czech Republic, I could imagine also English is probably the language that everyone speaks in the rehearsal room for the singers. But I'm guessing the orchestra.
Whereas when I worked in Prague in 1976, it was Italian.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. No one spoke. It was still under communism.
Extraordinary.
And, it was Easter time of 1976. Yep. And we spoke Italian. And I'm not ancient because in 76 I was 20. So to give you an idea. But the second part of that question, because we spoke about opera, but also symphonically. But the second part of the question is you conduct in many countries. all of whom practically have their national music traditions.
Mhm.
They're the big countries like Germany, Austria, France, UK, Italy, Spain, and so on. But I know you've conducted in Norway, Trondheim. Do
Mhm.
Norwegian musicians feel a special guardianship and affinity for Grieg in a way that
Great.
someone coming from elsewhere would not or could not?
Yeah.
Or I wonder whether it would happen in the Czech Republic with Smetana or
Yeah, of course.
yeah.
You
So how
feel
does
it.
that work if you're an American guy from New York coming in?
Oh, I love that though. I mean,
Okay.
that's one of my favorite things actually. It's Grieg is a perfect example in Norway. Yeah, but and they if you could do it Leif Ove Ansnes and the Trondheim Symphony, yeah, it's gonna they're gonna have pride and it's gonna be great. Or the Bergen Symphony or Oslo Philharmonic. But you Scandinavian orchestras are very similar to American orchestras. Kind of have musicality that comes from Europe and then the efficiency that comes from the US or the UK. It's like it's living in between. So I think they're special in that respect. In Sweden too, in Stockholm, they're extraordinary orchestras,
Wonderful.
very versatile. But the Czech Philharmonic, I got to work with the Czech Philharmonic a lot in the Dvorak Festival and normal subscription series. And I've done a lot of Dvorak with them. This was interesting for me because some things that I've tried my whole life with American orchestras to get them to feel a rhythm. Dum 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 dum. You could say, yeah, the little note comes close to the big note. You could say all these things with words, but it never. It's like the Vienna Philharmonic playing Strauss. It's something in their blood, and it truly is in their blood.
Yeah.
Certain American critics would disagree because they would say Dvorak is essentially an American composer at a certain period of his time. But the
Yeah.
Czech play it. I learned so much from them. The way they phrase things, and it was a magical experience. And yeah, I learned a lot. I also learned a lot from the Vienna Philharmonic, being in the pit at the Staatsoper for both La Boheme or Traviata, not just Germanic Austrian repertoire. I think there's something special there, and you can't define it in words. It's stylistic. It's the way they sway, or even Italian orchestras that don't always get the best reputation. Suddenly they'll play a line, and it will have this amazing singing quality to it, and you can't explain why. Or French. I've done a lot of French repertoire with the National de France and Orchestre de Paris. It comes naturally to them. Whereas a lot of German orchestras playing things like La Mer, they're very intimidated by it, but they can play it well. So I think
Um,
it's fun.
I can imagine. You mentioned Leif Ove Ansnes. I don't speak about often about my favorites, but when someone is my favorite or among them, I say it. Leif Ove Ansnes, the Norwegian pianist, is one of my favorites.
He's very special.
And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to have him join me on this program.
Hmm.
And so people can go to YouTube or Idacho and enter Fred Plotkin, Leif Ove Ansnes. And it was a wonderful conversation. And in part because, James, we started by talking about Brooklyn.
Huh.
And he has a strong feeling for New York and especially Brooklyn. And that was not where I thought we would begin our
Ah, that's so
conversation.
funny.
Because the date June 15th, 1993, was the 150th anniversary of Grieg's birth. And I was invited to give a lecture in Bergen, where he was born. And a young pianist, 15 years old, I think, named Leif Ove Ansnes, was then going to play the Grieg Piano Concerto in A major. And that's where I first heard him when he was about 15, and I was pretty young too.
Wow.
And from that point forward, I thought, who is this
Yeah.
very young musician that is not just great technician, but so much artistry
Exactly.
and soul? And for all the times I'd heard the Grieg Piano Concerto by everyone, it's as if I heard it for the first time. And that's why I fastened on this idea that maybe there is something extra
Yeah.
in Norwegian playing the Grieg Piano Concerto in the city of Grieg's birth on potentially Grieg's piano or a successor of Grieg's piano. It's in the herring. It's in something there that is very particular. And as we internationalize in many ways, that's a good thing. I nonetheless sometimes love to hear a person from his or her own country play music that they grew up with and they're an exponent of,
Oh yeah,
like hearing an American play American music, just the same.
yeah. No, it's absolutely true. He's one of my favorite too. I'm very honest. I had my Cleveland Orchestra debut on subscription series with him playing the Dalbavi piano concerto. Very complicated new piece that was written for him, and it was the premiere of the piece. And Franz Welser-Most got sick, and I jumped in, and I loved it. I loved it. It was an extraordinary experience, and we became friends, and we've done a few things together. But he's a very special artist. I agree with
Oh, boy.
you. Yeah.
I feel that way about Alfred Brendel.
Oh yeah.
I have those same feelings for Leif
I
Hans.
never got to work with Alfred Brendel.
I have completely other and equally passionate feelings for Marta Argerich, but they're not the same feelings that, I mean, I love them all.
Well, that's what's fun. That's what's fun about these people. I mean, they couldn't be more different. I've had the pleasure of working with Marta Argerich 3 times. Every time is a roller coaster. I mean, you have no idea what it feels like to accompany her, because sometimes she's running down a mountain. Other times it's just like the most beautiful thing you've ever heard in your life, and you realize you have to conduct. And she's so charismatic, so funny,
Yeah.
and that sometimes backstage so fragile. She'll just say, "James, wait, I'm nervous," and I'll look at her and say, "Well, I'm more nervous than you are. I could promise you that." She's like, "Well, I don't think so. What will you do if I stop?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "What would you do in the performance if I stop?" I said, "Well, if you literally stop and don't know what's coming next." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I'll show you the music and then we'll start again." "Okay, you promise?" I said, "Yeah." I mean, little things like this you wouldn't expect Marta Argerich to be saying backstage.
Musicians, and not only actors and stripteasers and surgeons and all kinds of people, put themselves entirely on the line in
Oh yeah.
terms of vulnerability, and
Yep.
they're expected to be in control.
Yes.
And there
Yep.
is that.
Yep.
And I had the great honor and pleasure of working with Morella Franey a lot,
Wow.
and really a lot from the very beginning of my career. And I remember one time she was doing at the Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic, the letter scene from Eugene Onegin. And she knew the Russian perfectly. Her husband was Bulgarian and he taught her the Russian. And in the middle of the letter scene, she just lost the
Yeah.
thread completely.
Yeah.
And
Happens.
she held her hand up and she turned to the conductor and she said, "I'm sorry, but let's do it again."
Yeah. Yeah. Come on.
And she did it. The audience was with her
Yeah.
and there was no criticism. It's like uh, Arthur Rubinstein would, hit a wrong note often on the piano when he was playing Chopin or whatever. And he would say, "Yes, but all the good notes that I did hit." Think of
Oh,
those.
absolutely.
So I want to focus with you in the last part of our conversation about the two companies that you're affiliated with now, because
Mhm.
I don't want to make it sound like you are the promiscuous conductor going from perch to perch to perch to perch and enriching and learning, all of which is very important. But you, because of the stature you've achieved and because of the quality of your work, which I've heard a lot, nice to see your face, which I've never seen. I've only seen your back. Um, are affiliated with two wonderful companies,
Mhm.
very different companies
Yeah.
in very different places.
Yeah.
And I know the Komische Oper better than I know the orchestra in Valencia, but I do know the orchestra in Valencia. And I'd like to start with that because if people have been to Valencia, I don't know how to describe the geography of the sort of long stretch of boulevard. It looks like there was a river there once.
Right.
And building after building after building, it's not like a Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, Performing Arts Center.
No.
It's more like Stations of the Cross for
Mhm.
different artistic institutions all along this road.
Yeah.
And you're in one of those buildings, and I've been in that building. It was built at a time when Spain, very to its credit, started building all kinds of theaters and arts institutions when Spain finally got rid of Franco and all that and began to be a democracy and express itself culturally. And people like Almodovar and a whole generation of actors came forth. But similarly, musicians who may have been under the yoke of fascism before, singers such as Montserrat Caballé, Teresa Berganza, Jose Carreras, Alfredo Kraus, who were these magnificent. I'm not mentioning Domingo because he was a world singer, born in Spain but grew up in Mexico. But obviously Domingo, um, they were living Spanish history in real time. I knew Carreras and Caballé quite well, and I remember in 1979 when they got to sing Andrea Chenier in the Liceu in Barcelona for the first time. They could print the program in Catalan in addition to Spanish.
Interesting.
The audience was Catalan, and they cast those two in one poems, and I forget the conductor, I should know this, but basically it was all Catalan artists.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in the audience at the Lyceum responded not only to the fantastic performance of Andrea Chenier, arguably the best opera performance I've ever been to, but also these were Catalans, and they could see themselves in it. In Spain, fascinating, diverse country. I love it very much. The food is great. The cultures, I say plural cultures, are distinct. But if you go to Galicia, and then you go to Nevada, and then you go to Valencia, and you go to Andalusia and Extremadura and Madrid and all that, these are very distinct places.
Yes. Yes.
And they see themselves both as Spaniards, especially when they're playing in the World Cup soccer, but often as of their regions. And Valencia has a proud tradition in terms of politics, in terms of literature, in terms of fighting fascism, very frankly. Valencia, unfortunately, recently had these horrible floods that came in the city. But it's, the word a proud city sometimes can be exaggerated. Valencia is a proud city.
Very, very proud city.
Talk
Valencia is a really unusual place that is it the third largest city in Spain?
Third or fourth, sometimes Seville, depends who you talk to.
So there's a little bit of kind of frustration. Madrid gets all the attention and all the money. That's the truth of it. And Barcelona is this other enclave, like it's something separate in a way. The Valencian people, the biggest strength and the biggest weakness is that it's provincial. It's provincial in the most beautiful way imaginable. It's provincial in the most frustrating way sometimes. But what I know about the people in Valencia and what I've come to love, they adore the art form. They adore the symphony. They adore the opera. They are traditional taste compared to some other places, like Amsterdam, for example. But they will fight for you. They will love you, and they will go crazy. And our young audience here is extraordinary. When we have the open dress rehearsals, the tickets sell out within an hour, and they come for €5, and they go bananas. For Tristan, for Wojciech, they stay to the end. They're silent. They are so captivated by what we're doing on stage. So I've fallen in love with the people in Valencia. The story of the Opera House is very strange, as you know some of it, probably. In the times of Helge Schmidt and Zubin Mehta and Lauren Mazel, they formed this orchestra out of the blue. The Calatrava building was built, and it was this like diamond period for Valencia, and it was a lot of, let's say, the money. It was a very strange situation, the private funding, and the people in Valencia were not really part of that. It was sort of like Lucerne. When the Lucerne Festival got built, the regular Lucerne people were kind of like, well, what do we need this for? They're still fighting to build an opera house in Lucerne, where I was for 11 years, because the general middle class.
They have the Jean Nouvel Theater, right?
Yes, the KKL.
Which is are the acoustics as good as I'm told?
Yes, it is the greatest modern hall in the world, in my opinion. And they want to build this opera house. They wanted, when Pierre Boulez was alive, he wanted to make the Salma di Lab. But the biggest issue is the regular people, like my parents, the middle class people of Lucerne, didn't feel welcome, let's say, or part of that world. And I think it's the same when you look at this gorgeous, I'm looking out the window now of the park, it used to be the old Turia River. It was a river, and then they drained the river. They put it through a different part of the city, around the city, because it used to flood a lot. And they built this incredible, beautiful park with all these incredible cultural institutions, like you mentioned. So it is very beguiling. It's like you see this from the plane when you land, and you think, "Whoa, a futuristic city of arts and culture." So it is gorgeous and it's wonderful. And the difference now with the orchestra is there are much more Spanish people in it than there were before. When Lauren Mazel formed it, it was, I would say, maybe 30% Spanish, and the rest was Russian, German, Ukrainian, Japanese, Chinese, whatever it might be, American. But now a lot of the talent that's coming in is Spanish, and some from Valencia, actually. So there's a lot of pride in this institution. It's known in circles as the most exciting and best orchestra in Spain, but it's not as famous as Madrid or Barcelona, but the orchestra plays, in my opinion, the best. Um, the productions we do are great, but again, very traditional. Like the most out of the ordinary thing we do is something like Wozzeck or Femme de Partie of Kortag, and people they're intimidated by it. But what happened with Wozzeck, people came for a second and third time, which we didn't expect to happen, and they loved it because it's a masterpiece. Once you get past the harmonic language, which is just slightly different. I love working here. This is going to be my last season because I need to give more room. I mean, it was never a plan of mine to have two opera houses. This was never it happened in a very strange way, and I couldn't say no to both institutions because they were so different. So the Comische Opera couldn't be more different than the traditional world of Valencia. At Comische, we could take extreme risks with the productions. We could take extreme risks with repertoire, and we know we will always have our audience base. And even now, when we're in the Schiller Theater, where the Staatsoper was for 8 years, temporarily, while our house is being renovated, our audiences come with us, and we've gained new audiences in Charlottenburg. So they're two opposite ends of the spectrum. Valencia does 6 opera productions, one of which is a zarzuela. Comische does tons of productions, many new productions, and every type of genre imaginable. So when I'm in Berlin, I have no time for anything but work. In Valencia, I have time to go to the beach. I have time to spend, eating great food, like you mentioned, paella, and tasting the.
Well, let's talk about one of my favorite food markets in the world is in Valencia.
It's incredible.
I could picture it as we're talking. It's been a few years, but I could take you there now and guide you to my favorite stalls.
Oh, it is. I was just there the other day and tearing up at the ladies that sell the olives because they are the sweetest ladies on the planet, and I love shopping there. I love that. There's 2 main markets, I would say. That the main market of Valencia, and then there's Rusafa market, which I also love. But you meet people there that come to the concerts. You meet people. There's a lot of tourists, but not overwhelmingly so, like Barcelona or New York City. I think the city of Valencia is very special because it's big enough and it's small enough. It's well kept. It's neat. It's clean. It's safe. I've never seen anything violent happening. The floods were a disaster for outside of the city, but the center of the city was pretty safe from the floods. But it was heartbreaking to see people lose their lives, their cars, their houses, but they came together and they did the best they could, and I'm happy our orchestra members are okay.
That part of Spain, in my experience, is all about solidarity.
Yeah.
And while Madrid is, cosmopolitan, there's the Movida and everything, and all of the other major cities tend to reflect their regions. Andalusia, Seville, and so on is very charming and a lot to love.
And I know
we're not in Toledo, and Barcelona is what it is. And certainly San Sebastian is a food mecca and beautiful with the Horseshoe Bay and so on. But the feeling I get from the people of Valencia is very particular.
It is. Well, I'll put it this way. If I were to get a vacation getaway place, it would be Valencia region. And I've fallen in love with this place for personal reasons and more than anything else. So it's a very special place in my heart. I'm coming back next season, even though I'm not music director anymore. I'll come back the following season for concerts. I adore this place, and it was a kind of accident. It all happened, but I'm happy it happened.
So one controversial question before we move up to Berlin. You grew up in New York City eating oranges in the United States. Now eat Valencia oranges. Which are better?
Valencia oranges.
I agree. I completely agree.
I also
Miss them.
I grew up drinking that, pasteurized. What is that? Like, Tropicana and all that stuff.
Yeah. But even the fresh oranges in
Oh no,
Florida, they're known. It's not the same thing. The
it's
Valencia
not the
oranges
same.
are
It's
just
not the same.
remarkable.
It's not the
They're
same.
fragrant. They're juicy. They're really terrific. Now, in Berlin, I guess if we're talking about oranges, it would be pears in Berlin. Birnen, frische Birnen. I remember I've worked a lot in Berlin, hearing people on the street selling Birnen, frische Birnen, fresh pears. Um, Berlin is a cultural mecca. We don't have
Yes.
to define it for anyone.
No.
But within that context, um, the Komische Opera is very special.
Yes, and it's
It
very
really
unusual.
is extraordinary. And although we historically have the opera in West Berlin on the Kudamm, the Deutsche Oper West Berlin, which I worked in Berlin for the first time in '79 before the wall came down. And I was staying in the West and at the Deutsches Oper West Berlin. And then I got to go to the East and go to the crumbling but absolutely spectacular Staatsoper on Unter den Linden, and one night to the Komische Oper where they were doing Tosca. And in East Berlin with the wall up and everything. And when Tosca jumped off the wall, or not the wall, but the parapet of the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, she jumped off the Berlin Wall. O scarpi avanti a Dio. The audience knew exactly what she was jumping off of and
Yeah.
into freedom, the Tiber
Wow.
River, the Spree River, whatever you prefer.
Yeah.
But they didn't have to say a word, but
Yeah.
everyone knew
Wow.
what that was. That was April 1979. So how did you wind up there? I'm sure unlike any other opera house you've ever worked in, but correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
I love Barry Kosky, who worked there for a long time.
He still does
love
as
their
president
production.
director. Yeah.
His Fiddler on the Roof, among other things, is just a fantastic production.
Unbelievable.
On the
Unbelievable.
Roof, Anatevka, as they call it in German.
Anatevka, exactly.
And just anything you want to tell us about that world, because
this is such a special
great world of opera. It's special.
It's so special and different than any other opera house. The productions, the directors, the type of singers we get. It's so special. And it was COVID, and they asked me, would you be interested in the position? We're looking at several people to be our next GMD. And I said no at first, because I didn't know anything about it, except that it was quirky. I knew Barry Kosky's productions, and I knew they were extraordinary. I saw his Onegin. I knew about The Fiddler, but I hadn't seen it yet at that point. And it was COVID times, and I did a concert with them with no audience, and we had to have distance. But I did Mozart, and I realized, wow, this is the way I've always imagined Mozart to be, to have this kind of muscular but light expression with modern instruments, but played with let's say, historical knowledge, let's say. I love the way they played Mozart. And we did a very complex piece of Webern too, which they took very seriously, never poo-pooed it, and it was very difficult. And I said, it was kind of a love affair in this 1 week. And I said, well, maybe I would be interested. And then one thing led to another. We decided to go forward with it. And I fell in love with the institution, with its quirkiness, with its identity in Berlin, because people respect it so much, and they always know they're in for a treat there. Barry Kosky was the one to finally convince me to take the job on the phone. His Anatevka, his Fiddler on the Roof, was one of those examples of a typical Tuesday night at the Komische Opera, and you're sitting there, it's sold out, and the intermission comes. You've seen the production, and it's heart-wrenching. It's everything I never expected to see in a Fiddler on the Roof, times 50. So, I mean, tears were just, it was out of control. And the orchestra took the music so seriously as they would Salome. So I knew I'm in the right place because I grew up in all different genres of jazz, rock music, classical, musical. So when they said we're doing a new production of Sweeney Todd of Barry's, I said, I want to do it. They said, you want to conduct Sweeney Todd? I said, of course. And I want to do some fiddlers too. I want to do some whatever. And this, it's right up my alley. It's kind of what I've been doing my whole life, and now I get paid to do it, and paid to do it seriously. And I believe that every genre of music should be well done, and that's what they do there. And whether it's a musical in English, and now they do it in the original languages. Most things we'll still do Shostakovich the Nose in German next season. But we'll do Lady Macbeth of Shostakovich in Russian, and we do Onegin in Russian and things like that. But I love the house. I love the dedication of the people there. I love that
Will you be doing the production of Onegin that exists?
It's Barry's production. I've done it already.
Wonderful,
it's gorgeous with the green grass, and when it rains, it's gorgeous.
Okay, good.
It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant, and I'm very proud of what we do there. I'm proud of the identity in Berlin that we have, because you could go to the Berlin Philharmonic to hear that, you could go to the Staatsoper to hear that, but you'll never get what you'll get at the Komische Oper. And I love the orchestra. They're very, very flexible, and they could go. The most successful concert we did so far was Bruckner and Bowie, where we did we did the David Bowie Heroes album orchestrated by a great young composer in a really effectful way. And then we also did Bruckner 6 on the first half. So we also performed this in an old, it's called the Vollgutslager. It's an old beer factory, a big, and the public went bananas. They went crazy. And we accomplished what we wanted to happen. We wanted the Bruckner people to hear David Bowie, and we wanted the David Bowie people to hear Bruckner, and the freaks like me who love both were very happy. So, I feel very much part of the right family there. It is quirky, it's different, but it's wonderful.
The final question, listeners know that I often ask my guests, especially when I don't know them personally, I write to them ahead and I just ask one question: name musicians or composers or performances that are particularly inspirational to you. And you sent 4 names, 3 of whom I think people know very well: Jesse Norman, Carlos Kleiber, and Wynton Marsalis. But there was another name that you added. It's someone I know. I worked with when he was quite the young artist, and now he's one of the leading recitalists in the world, Nick Pan, Phan, who was my guest on the show 3 years ago. And so absolutely I agree with you, but why Nick Pan?
Nick is someone I've known since Glyndebourne. We had our debuts at Glyndebourne, he sang Fenton in Falstaff. We became close. He was this very charismatic, handsome guy who had a beautiful tenor voice, but very unlike the other tenors I was working with.
Yeah.
The other tenors I was working with were either screamers, or they had a beautiful voice and not so intelligent, maybe. Some of them very highly intelligent, but hard to work with. Nick Pan was a breath of fresh air for me. Yeah. And Nick Pan, like me, likes a lot of different genres. Nick is the example that a singer can be smart and cultured and do many things, not just one thing. And I also believe that Nick Pan is an example for the future of what young singers need to be for society. I mean, Nick has a very diverse background. He is openly gay. He is a confident young man. He is articulate, which I think we need to be when addressing the audience these days and helping people understand what we do. Nick is, Nick, the reason I named Nick on your huge list, as I went like 100 down, I saw his name and I just said Nick Pan, because he's the example of what I want my colleagues to be like. Open, willing to compromise. So if we do a Bach B minor mass together in Lucerne, there's a give and take. We can talk about the music. We're flexible about this, but he brings ideas, I bring ideas to the table, and he's not close-minded. So I think the reason I mention him is that he's an example to all young singers of what you can be like and the success that you can have, not following the typical path, let's say.
So it triggers one more question. I was going to be clever and say, do you look at Nick or does Nick look at you when you're performing? But the real question I'd ask is the following. In much repertory with orchestras, the conductor is on the podium facing the orchestra, and the singers are over your shoulder and facing the audience.
Yeah.
How do you coordinate the music making?
You feel them and you predict them. And I would say my predictions are normally right. Sometimes it's a 50-50 guess in a very complex moment. But I think if you know the person and they're an organic musician, which Nick is an example of an organic musician, so is Jessie Norman. When she takes time, she gives it back. And it's never, it's like Frank Sinatra rubato. When Frank Sinatra takes time, the band is still going in tempo. He always brings it back. Great opera singers are like that too. That you need to know what goes up comes down, and Nick is a perfect example of that. And I think he's an example for all young artists, that young singers, when they say, "Well, I take a little time here," and then if a conductor says, "Why?" you should have a reason, not because it feels good. And Nick Pon is a type of person that says, "Well, because this cadence needs time," or because I'm predicting that this phrase needs a little extra time because of whatever reason. But I just think he's someone looking back towards traditions of the past and looking forward. And I think this is the type of person I like working with.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I want to tell listeners two things. If you want to hear more of Nick Pon, you go to YouTube or adagio.com and enter Fred Plotkin, Nick Pon, Phan. If you want to hear more about Jessie Norman, who I did a show about recently, you do Fred Plotkin, Mark Markham, Markham, who did nearly 300 performances with Jessie and gave such wonderful insight into her artistry and the way she worked. James Gaffigan, nice to meet you.
It's such a pleasure to meet you, Fred. It's a real pleasure.
And I look forward to meeting you. We're going to go for Italian food on Staten Island.
I'm going to bring you. I'll bring you on the ferry. It's free.
I know it's free.
For now.
And in the meantime, James Gaffigan, I thank you very much and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Fred.